All right, hello and happy Friday, June 20th, everyone. Welcome to episode 41 of PatristiCast. I'm your host, John Solheid, today. Very excited to welcome Jack Bull. Jack is a lecturer of biblical studies at St. Mary's University in London, England. And he is also I guess would be co-founder, is that right? Co-founder and main host of the podcast Patristica. Jack, welcome to PatristiCast.
Pleasure. It's about time we made a visit on this channel.
So I thought I would begin. So this channel is PatristiCast, and you have Patristica, very
Mhm.
similar. Um, when I started this, when I started having the ideas of this podcast in the fall of 2020. I didn't really know what to call it. I wanted to keep the name short, so I did Patcast. So I asked my friend Don Springer in Hamilton,
Oh.
Ontario, what do you think of that name? And he said, "Well, I think it sucks. I think it doesn't convey as much information." And I said, "Okay." Then I got passive aggressive. I'm like, "Okay, fine. That's too short. What about Patristics Cast?" Even though that I knew that name was just horrible. And he said, "Well, why don't we just split the difference and call it PatristiCast?" It's worked.
Yeah.
Patristica. What's the story behind that name?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said to you earlier, I'm jealous of your name because I actually think it's top drawer. Um, ours is just the rip-off of the International Patristics Journal, which is called Studia Patristica. And I just thought, well, Studia Patristica, it's a little bit long. And also, we're not directly associated with the conference.
Mhm.
So, again, a bit like Split the Difference, we'll just go with Patristica,
Yeah.
which, if you are a Latin speaker, is actually a bit of a funny name. But for the English speakers who don't have very good Latin, it just sounds great and a bit Oriental. And
Mhm.
so it's kind of fun. But yeah, we started about 3 years ago. And Marcus Vincent, who is also an editor of the International Patristics Journal, along with Dr. Mark Bilby, are my two co hosts and colleagues. And we do a lot on Marcion and Ignatius of Antioch in the second century. And sometimes we dabble a little bit further, but that's the main focus.
So, aside from your work on Patristica and your teaching responsibilities at St. Mary's in London, what are you working on these days? What's keeping you busy?
Well, I spent all of my life reading about Ignatius of Antioch every single day of my life. He seems to be the eternal plague. And for a man that only wrote, well, we'll come on to how many letters he may or may not have written, but let's say he wrote 17, which is all the letters we have attributed to him, he does tend to fill a majority of my life, which is
Hmm.
kind of crazy. And I'm often very jealous of you guys who work in a later period with figures like Origin, who have got a plethora of material to go through and always keep variety and change and these different little subplots and things. Ignatius is always the same 17 letters and they're not going to change and even they're not very long. So that's what I spend most of my time working on. But I'm also doing some work with Marcion of Sinope with my colleagues, who I find another interesting character.
Uh-huh.
And I've recently moved a little bit into manuscripts and in the efforts to learn a little bit more about paleography and those sorts of things so that I can create a critical edition of the
Hmm.
Ignatian manuscripts. So that's where I'm spending my time at the moment. And like all good early Christian scholars, trying to learn 50 languages at once, failing at least two-thirds of them, and maybe grasping 10% of the information that I see.
Join the club. That's about the same for me when it comes to languages. Are you familiar with the Lincoln College summer program in Greek paleography at Oxford?
No, I'm not actually.
It's a week long. I can't remember if they do it every other year or how it goes. Christos Similides and Dimitrios Grekas are the two who put it on. So I did that last year, right before the International Patristics Conference at Oxford. Very enjoyable, and if you're interested in um, developing the skills to create a critical edition, that might be a good thing to look at if you haven't done any formal paleography training yet. So I thought I'd plug them in. It's a good
There you
program.
go. He's on commission, guys, so be careful.
Um, okay, so Ignatius of Antioch. Before we get into Ignatius himself, so you said you've spent uh, the better part of your life now basically reading and studying Ignatius. How did you how did you land there? What got you interested in Ignatius?
Oh man, I mean, so this will be my this is my 10th, almost 11th year of reading Ignatius of Antioch's epistles. Um, and for different reasons. So I actually sort of came to Catholicism through the epistles of Ignatius of
Hmm.
Antioch in their widely accepted seven letters in the Middle Recension. If you don't know what that means, don't worry, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But basically, if you've picked up Ignatius in the past, that's what you will have found, this edition that I read. And it went well. And I thought, well, many of the things that he says seems pretty Catholic to me, so let's do that. And in 2018, I began a master's at King's College London with Marcus Vincent. And he just finished and sent to proofs his then new book, The Writing of Early Christianity. And he began to talk about Ignatius. And he said, look, these epistles of Ignatius that we have, seven letters, they're not real. Only three of them are real and in a shorter version. And I lost it. I mean, I was furious. I mean, I was truly livid with him, and I thought he was really speaking out of turn. And he was so calm, so polite in the face of my rudeness. And he said, "Well, would you like a copy of my new book?" I thought, "Yeah, I'm going to show you. Give me that." Now, bear in mind, for those of you who don't know Marcus Vincent, I mean, he's been in the game sort of 35 years, has more languages than you can shake a stick at, and I was a upstart who had two semesters of Koine Greek. So, I mean, it wasn't really a fair fight.
Hmm.
So I'm reading this book, and I got to the end of his chapter. It's only one chapter, so he didn't even need the whole book to convince me. And I thought, oh, bugger, I think he's right. And at that point, I went back to him. I ate my slice of humble pie, big though it was, and said, I'd like to do a PhD with you because I don't think that you finished this job, actually. I think there's more to say about why you're correct. And he said, good, let's do that. And so I started my PhD in 2020. I finished it in 2022 or three. I think it only took me about 2.5 years. Um, and yeah, that was how I came to the question. And I can't seem to put him down even now. Uh, which again, like I say, for a guy who has such a minimal amount of work extant, is is unbelievable to me. Actually, I think if you'd have said to me even when I started my PhD in 2020, well, you'll be doing this far past your PhD, I'd have said no way. I mean, it'll be solved. And of course, nothing in biblical or early Christian studies is ever solved. But you get my point. I thought I'd be just
Yep.
done with it, and yet here we are.
Yeah, it really is amazing. A lot of my friends who are not academics, when I told them that I was going for a PhD in theology and I was going to study patristics, they said, "Well, don't we already know everything?"
Ah,
And God bless their hearts for asking that. Um, it is easy to think that because we've had 1,800 years between us that these things have been studied to death, but really, the development of new knowledge never really stops, does it? Regardless of how limited our resources are.
and we'll find out with Ignatius that actually, ironically, one of the reasons I find him such an interesting character is because people did think they had it solved, which, as you said, in our field is almost entirely unheard of. I mean, in biblical scholarship, we'd argue if the sky was blue or black or grey or green. I mean, we just
Mhm.
can't help ourselves. But Ignatius actually was considered solved,
Mhm.
and I think that's one of the reasons I stuck to him like glue. But again, we'll come on to it.
So the you mentioned the letters.
Mm.
Uh, talk about the letters. I'm presuming when you say what did you identify? Seven of them, right? Then that would be in Lightfoot's edition. Is that correct? Where those letters are?
Yeah,
Um,
Lightfoot is a dirty word on patristica. Uh, and that's not a popular opinion among early Christian scholars. Let me tell you, that man is idolized. But for me, I think he's a dirty word, and I haven't got a lot of time for that. But we'll go again.
yeah,
We'll talk about the letters. So
yeah, yeah. Let's talk about the letters. Yeah, what's going on with those letters?
so it's interesting. In Michael Holmes's volume on the Apostolic Fathers, he mentions how they're basically unheard of for 1,500 years following their writing. And he's largely right. I mean, apart from Eusebius, I think he causes the anomaly.
Mhm.
For almost 1,000 years, nobody cares about Polycarp, Ignatius, even Clement, or whatever. And it's only really in the 15th and 16th centuries that these things start to flood back to the minds of Christians. And the Ignatian question, I suppose, and we'll go back later to Eusebius, but the question really starts to come up in 1495 when these three letters appear in Latin, appended to, sorry, the life of Thomas Becket, of all
Oh,
people.
that's
So
strange.
strange. And these three letters are ones you'll almost certainly never have heard of if you're not an Ignatian scholar. They are from Ignatius to John the Apostle. He wrote two to him, and one to the mother of Jesus, and then her response. So three Ignatian epistles and one response, which, let me tell you, they caused a bit of a stir because people believed they were real. Imagine that. I mean, extant material from the Virgin Mary and John the Apostle, whew, that hits
That's a
headlines.
find of a lifetime.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But you see, what's interesting is that nobody really talked about their authenticity. They just went, yeah, here they are.
Mhm.
And then in 1498, things started to change massively because another Latin edition came, and this Latin edition had Trallians, Magnesians, Tarsicians, Philippians, Philadelphians, Smyrnaeans, Polycarp, epistle to the Antiochians, to the deacon hero, Ephesians, and Romans. Gosh, that always takes a moment. And again, they were received very well. People just said, well, yeah, these are all going to be Ignatian. And then a few years later, even more appeared a letter to this woman called Mary of Casabolita and her response to him. So now we've got a total of 17 epistles by 1516 out in the ether. And it's not until about the middle of the 16th century where people begin to say, I don't know, man, some of these look a bit funky to me. And then we get the three that are only extant. Oh, well, actually, sorry, they're all extant only in Latin at this point. But the three that began in Latin, Mary, the Virgin, and the Apostle John, they're just got rid of. People say, no, 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 that really is, come on now. And they stick with just the others. And in the middle of the 16th century, they then find a Greek edition of all the ones they thought were genuine.
Mhm.
So just not the three or four, including Mary's response that I mentioned earlier. So Mary, Casapolita, Trallians, Magnesians, Tarsicians, Philippians, Philadelphians, Smyrnaeans, Polycarp, Antiochians, Hero, Ephesians, Romans. Right? And we've now got a Greek and a Latin, and things are going well. And essentially, a big argument then comes about because of these epistles, based on their authenticity. Because if you believe them, then they're basically extolling loads of Catholic theology.
Mhm.
So Calvin turns around and says there's nothing more absurd than to believe that Ignatius wrote these things. Because he can't admit that, because the threefold ecclesial hierarchy is there, Eucharistic theology is there, so he just dismissed them out of hand. And similarly, not to put too much weight, just on that side, Catholics just accept them point blank because they back everything they've ever thought up anyway.
Yeah.
And that's the beginning of the problem,
Mhm.
right? People just assessing these things solely based on their theology. And it's not until James Ussher, the great Bishop of Armagh, that he then says, actually, I think all of these texts are a bit funky. And he says, I think there's a shorter version of all of these texts. And lo and behold, he finds a shorter version of these texts. So all of the same letters, 13 letters, but in a shorter version in Latin. And he says, I think these are genuine. And so now we have these two sets. We have a long collection and a short collection. And the terminology is going to get very difficult very quickly, so you're going to have to stick with me. You've got a long and a short. Okay. He says, I think this short version would probably once have existed in Greek as well. And a little bit later, Isaac Voss finds this short recension in Greek. And that then becomes, aha, yes, these are the genuine ones, and these 13 letters in Greek. And then there begins a discussion. Well, we go back to Eusebius now. Eusebius says that he knows Ignatian epistles, but he only knows 7 of them. And that immediately then says to people, well, then the others probably aren't true. Only 7 are probably genuine. Magnesians, Philadelphians, Smyrnaeans, Polycarp, Romans. Try and remember them all. So many. Smyrnaeans, Polycarp, Ephesians, Magnesians, Philadelphians, Romans. What's the third one? Trallians. There you
Really?
go. There's the seven. Yeah. And because Eusebius enumerates those as the ones that he knows, everyone then settles with, well, the shorter version of the Greek manuscript of the seven letters, they're genuine. Happy days. No one bats an eyelid. And again, for the first time, we get the idea that the Ignatian manuscript problem is solved. Seven letters, Greek, fine. And then my great hero makes a big problem. In the 1800s, a man is sent out by the name of Henry Tatham to the Nitrian desert, to the monastery of St. Mary di Para. And in there he finds three manuscripts with the Ignatian epistles in Syriac,
Hmm.
but there's only three epistles in them. Well, there's two epistles. Sorry, there's two manuscripts with three epistles, and one manuscript that just has one epistle in it. Polycarp, and they're in a shorter version again. So now we've got three recensions: a long recension, a middle recension, and a short recension. So that what was the short recension is now the middle. You see what I mean?
Yep.
This is why you start to get a bit bogged down in this stuff. And Curiton argues, very strongly in my opinion, that the short version of the three letters in Syriac is the genuine. Originally, everyone comes around him and agrees, including J.B. Lightfoot, the dirty name that we mentioned earlier. Until J.B. Lightfoot in 1885 changes his mind and writes, based on Theodore Zahn's 1873 edition, several volumes arguing in favour of the middle recension of Ignatius in the seven letter collection. And basically, I kid you not, from 1885 all the way to 2019, nobody really properly asked the question again. There were some, like Reinhard Hubner, Thomas Lechner, and Robert Joly, and a couple of others who said, well, actually, none of these are real. But no one ever, from Curiton to Marcus, looked at the short recension again. None of them ever considered it or even looked into the scholarship behind it ever for over 130 years.
The Syriac translation?
The Syriac short recension, yeah. Which is bananas, right? Scholars not debating things properly for 150 odd years, to me, is just wild. Absolutely wild. So, to not make things any more complex just for this point, when I came to the question, there was the short, the middle, and the long recension, and they were extant in a three-letter collection, seven-letter collection, and a 13-letter collection, or at least that's what Lightfoot claimed.
So, there probably some people here who are going to watch this or listen to it and not really know what the hell we're talking about with recensions, and this gets into the tricky business of manuscripts
Mm.
and textual transmission through the years, through the centuries. Um, where do you happen to know how many of the middle recension manuscripts we have and how far back they're dated versus that Syriac one in Nitria, Egypt, right?
Mhm.
So we're dealing with perhaps emerged out of a monastic community there. What's the status of the manuscripts right now? Like what do we have?
Well, that was my first question. And as soon as I asked that question, what I realised, even if you have just grasped the nomenclature with which I've just said, it's only going to get worse because this version of three recensions and three letter collections, so short, middle, long, three letter collection, seven letter collection, 13 letter collection, when I went to actually the manuscripts, is entirely false. So all of the questions that scholarship was asking was built on I'll generously not call it a lie from Lightfoot, a oversimplification.
Hmm.
There we go. That's a nice way of calling
It's
it.
charitable.
Yeah, yeah. An oversimplification on Lightfoot's behalf. When I went back to the manuscripts, the first thing I realised was that of the short recension, what we're dealing with there is not just a three-letter collection, because there's one manuscript in the British Museum that just has Polycarp in it.
Mm.
It is not joined by any other epistle. So already my mind went, well, there's not just a 3, 7, and 13. There's a 1 letter collection, right? As stupid as that sounds. When I then went to Romans, Romans doesn't just have one manuscript where it's attested on its own. It has hundreds where Romans only appears on its own. And not just as a letter, but as part of the Acts of Martyrdom of Ignatius. And so now we're dealing with not just a letter by itself, but it's in the middle of these Acts of Martyrdom. So it's part of another textual tradition. Then I found, and Marcus found, Arabic manuscripts, which are different, not just in terms of letter collection, but with different content in it of Romans. So now I've got at least 5 recensions, 4 letter collections, and then I found out that most of the letter collections of the middle recension don't even have Romans in it. Okay, so now my problem is wildly spinning out of control. The crux of it for the viewer is this, unless you want to buy my PhD when it comes out with Peters for an astronomical price beyond people's imagination. The TLDR is this, and this was the thing that almost blew me off my chair. We have no manuscript of a middle recension of 7 letters, which is the commonly accepted, universally scholarly accepted opinion. That manuscript does not exist. Whenever we find the middle recension, it's only as part of a 13-letter collection. So we're dealing with smoke and mirrors. It's ghosts that we're dealing with. We work only, as you mentioned earlier, on Lightfoot's edition, but that's a concoction of his own mind. Because even within that, he cherry picks some of the Syriac readings and translates it into the Greek, or some of the Latin readings and translates it into Greek. And he's open about that. He doesn't even butter it up. So what the Lightfoot edition, which all scholarly work is based on, particularly if they're dealing with just the theology of Ignatius, is only a man-made creation. So what I've come to the conclusion is that we have 5 recensions, a short, a middle, a long. Then we have this Arabic special one, and then this this Ignatius Martyrdom one. Right, we have all these recensions. And then on top of that, how many letter collections we're dealing with? We've got 2 1-letter collections of just Polycarp and just Romans. We've got the 3, a 7. There is a 7-letter collection, but it's only the long recension. Then we've got a 9.5-letter collection, which is actually the biggest family of manuscripts. There's loads of those. I say 9.5 because halfway through Tarsicians, it's corrupted. Then we've only got an 11, a 12, a 13, a 15, a 16, and a 17-letter collection. And at this point, you say, well, my goodness, I feel sick.
Yeah, right. Dizzying.
And yeah. Now, again, just to give a TLDR on what our oldest ones are and roughly when they're dated. Look, most of these longer recensions in Latin are medieval. So to some extent, we could just say, for the sake of our question of which text is earliest, for the most part, we could just plump them to one side. They're late, they're Latin, they're heavily canonicalized, Catholic theologyized, excuse my study adverbs. In terms of the oldest ones, we have a Syriac collection, the Syriac 3-letter collection, dating to the 6th, maybe 7th century. So quite old.
Yep.
And before that, we didn't really have, until very recently, a middle recension that's that old. But a fragment has been published not all that long ago of Smyrnaeans, which is only in the middle recension, never in the short, which also dates back to the 6th century. So some have used that as an argument against me to show an early dating for a middle recension text. And again, Eusebius does know Smyrnaeans, so people think that's probably likely. So they're the sort of oldest manuscripts we have. And to be honest, though, I don't put a lot of my stake in trying to trace the oldest version of the text in just the manuscript dates. And I'll tell you a bit more about why that is later. But just to say, I mean, people think this is a great argument against me. This early version of Spenneans has been found. It's like, well, yeah, but also no.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people don't realize, especially for somebody who was in the second century, that we just don't have the autographs. We don't have the originals. So we're dependent on copies that are probably copies of other copies,
Yeah,
which makes it so much more difficult. And it sounds like the letter, one might think that a letter collection, especially one that's, relatively small, I mean, we're not talking hundreds of letters here, um, but even if there was a dozen, one might suspect that they would be copied together so that you'd see in the manuscript tradition all the letters of Ignatius together. But it sounds like what you're saying is that, for example, the British Museum, you said there's that it just has one letter
just
uh,
Polycarp.
to Polycarp, and so in that manuscript, I'm curious, is it uh, does it come along with other writings, or is it just by itself?
No,
Or
no, no. It's part of a larger
yeah,
manuscript with
yeah,
other texts. Um, but there's a really important methodological point here.
yeah,
And it's not one that goes down very well with our New Testament colleagues or indeed with other early Christian colleagues. But it's namely this that whenever you're dealing with a corpus, you're not dealing with the original text.
hmm
Now, you can say to me, well, actually, that all they've done is just staple them together, right? They've not corrupted them.
hmm
Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, that sounds a bit too much
hmm
like Jordan Peterson. Um, it's not as clear as all that. Um, because, like I say, as soon as you get them together, well, that's not the form they came in.
yeah,
The form they came in was on their own, if we believe the
hmm
story.
hmm
So actually, finding Polycarp on its own and Romans on its own, to me, is far more intriguing, actually, than these later corpora. Because, like I say, you would believe that if Ignatius did write anything, he wrote it to Polycarp.
yeah,
So why would it be with anything else?
hmm
But again, we never. That's a methodological question that's often not perceived by colleagues, particularly with Paul.
hmm
I think is a big problem. Um, and again, that problem is only exacerbated by the fact that when we're dealing with Paul, most recognise not that I'm necessarily in this camp, but an authentic seven letters of Paul, and then a Deutero Paul, and then a pseudonymous Paul.
hmm
But they don't even think about those in terms of manuscripts, right? Like if they did exist in their original form, well, then perhaps then only the genuine ones would be found on their own. But Deutero Paul actually may have even began its life as a corpus,
hmm
or definitely pseudonymous Paul began its life as a corpus,
hmm
right? So these are already questions that I'm beginning to ask: is when people get these texts and append them together, does that mean they've already had some form of touching up or
right.
moving? And that's important to ask, even if you think I'm wrong. It's still an important recognition, I
Mhm.
think.
Well, and not just that, not just whether scribes may add or subtract something from a text that they're copying, but just the scribal errors that they make too. I mean, these things were copied by hand, which results in all kinds of mistakes that can happen. And
Yeah,
the material itself, whether parchment or papyrus, is very prone to getting damaged over time. So I'm sure there are probably so you mentioned one section. I can't remember which letter it was or which manuscript it was, but you said it had gotten corrupted. Um, is
yeah.
that is that like material corruption, or is that where a scribe is doing something funny with the text?
No, no. So this is we don't really know what we assume that the family of manuscripts goes back to one that in any way was damaged
hmm
because it, like I say, it cuts off halfway through a letter,
hmm
and literally like in the middle of a line, and always then begins with the Epistle of Barnabas straight afterwards.
Oh,
So one
interesting.
leads into the other. So clearly something went wrong there,
Yeah.
but that's our largest collection of our largest family collection, I think, including some of the really important ones. So
hmm
these are from um, uh, the 10th and 11th century and all the way to like manuscripts of the 1646 one, Codex Barberini something,
hmm
68 maybe, something
hmm
like that.
hmm
So you can see that family just kept happening.
Yeah.
Um, And so that was a big problem. But then again, that's one of the main families that people put their middle recension in.
Mhm.
That's one of the main manuscript families they use. But very people then recognize that, oh, there's a problem.
Yeah, that's interesting because I'm translating right now Origins on Prayer, and there's only one manuscript of it
Mhm.
at Cambridge at Trinity College, Cambridge. And in the first, I think maybe three uh, pages of the manuscript, there's lacunae it's a gap, and it stops right in the middle of the line, and then there's a big space, and then it picks up again in the middle of the line. But we don't have any other manuscripts of it. So the manuscript from which this one is copied that we have must also have been damaged somehow, or who knows what happened to it because we just don't have anything older or any other versions of it, which is actually quite frustrating for those of us who study these things because there's not really a way for us to find out what's in there. But it does remind us of the fragile nature of these documents that we study from the past and how difficult they are.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I'm so grateful for the Syriac ones that came to us so neatly. And what's really beautiful about the Syriac ones, and this to me, I think is quite an interesting thing. So in the manuscript for of the three, in the middle one that was found, which is British Museum 768. I always get confused. 768 and 789, but 768. What's really interesting there is what the scribe has done. That this Syriac text, I should say, is quite obviously from a Greek translation. So our scribe is clearly dealing with a Greek text because he transliterates loads of words
Okay.
and also uses Greek syntax in Syriac sometimes, which doesn't make it read nicely. But he clearly is trying his best to be literal here.
Mhm,
What's interesting is that at the end of each one, it says, "Here ends the first epistle of Ignatius."
mhm.
Right? So he's making a very bold statement that this is it.
Yep.
Whereas all of the Greek ones don't say that; they just flow one into the other, and it will
Ah,
say, the final greetings, and then the next one will begin Ignatius, who is Theophorus to the church in wherever. But this guy has made a really clear distinction. No, no, that's all he's got in his manuscript, and he can't tell you anything else.
mm.
And now, whether that's because he knows of other stories or other manuscripts or he's aware of them is unknown to me. But I do think that's a really interesting insight into the mind he has, that he feels it necessary to say, actually, here ends the first. And at the end of it, he says, here ends the epistles.
Mm.
That's it. We're done. Move on.
It's actually very helpful for the readers to know when one ends. And I mean, you could tell because at the end of letters, they usually have some kind of blessing that they give, or they end in some kind of
Ah,
prayer. So it makes it okay. Yeah, you have
wow.
something to say
Yeah,
about that?
I do. Yeah. So here is one of the really funky things about the short recension. It doesn't have those clear endings.
Hmm.
Ah. So,
The
where in the
short
middle
recension, you mean
recension,
the Syriac one where the
yeah,
scribe put in, here is the end of the epistle. Okay.
yeah. So that might be one of the reasons he does it. So for example, if you read the middle recension, you get all of the nice friendly greetings. So as Ignatius goes to sign off his letters, he greets Alki or the wife of Epitrupus or whoever it might be, the people in the area. In the short recension, you don't know what he's going to end with. I mean, it's wild. He has no formula at all. I mean, okay, you only have three letters, so it's hard to say, well, what's a formula? But
Mhm.
he always opens his letters in the exact same way. Ignatius, the one who is Theophorus. Fine. In the short recension in Polycarp, he ends it with, "I greet." He said, "Well, he says the Christian has no power over himself. I greet the one who's been sent to Antioch in my stead."
Hmm.
I was like, "Well, yeah, okay, but you'd think there'd be more people around Polycarp who you might want to greet. But do you know what? Fine, fine, we'll take it." In the middle recension, sorry, in the letter to the Ephesians in the short recension, he has the star hymn, which is a bananas piece of text, which basically says that there were three great mysteries hidden from the ruler of this world. Presumably, he means the devil or
Mhm.
Satan or someone like that. And they are uh, the things of Jesus' birth, and his birth brought about the end of chaos,
Mhm.
not the crucifixion, not the resurrection. In the short recension, Ignatius doesn't even know about the resurrection.
Mhm.
That's an entirely unknown quantity to him. So he just ends it with, and all of it was brought back into order because of this birth.
Mm.
Yeah, well, that's a funny ending for a text, no?
Right.
And you're just left, and you expect there to be another page. So that might have been one of the reasons why the scribe felt it necessary to put it in, because we don't get a natural climax.
Fascinating. Okay. So I can't help but think here that for our conversation, we really jumped right into what would be Ignatius of Antioch. If we were to title this course, it'd be like a 1,000 level course. It'd be a very advanced level course. But yeah, let's go back to some of the basics. Let's do Ignatius 101.
Mm.
Who was Ignatius of Antioch?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. We put the cart before the horse in many ways. But I think just to go back to that for 1 second, I think one of the issues we have so many problems with Ignatian scholarship is because scholars have wanted to just make this an easy thing.
Mhm,
And I think one of the reasons it's so neglected is because it's really, really grim.
mhm,
Uh, and that's why I want the revival to be somewhere maybe in between the gross and the simplification.
mhm,
Um, so Ignatius, well, depending on which recension you read, will tell you a lot about the fellow you're dealing with. Um, Traditionally, Ignatius of Antioch is in some way a friend of the Apostle John. He is elected to the see of Antioch after Peter. Now, there's probably another fellow called Evodius, who is the interim between Peter and Ignatius as the bishop. And from Antioch, he is arrested and sent from Antioch to Rome to be killed at the behest of Trajan.
mhm,
And along this journey, he stops across Asia Minor through to Greece and Europe, Italy, and writes these 7 beautiful letters explaining how excited he is to die for Jesus. And he really is excited,
mhm,
so much so that in his letter to the Romans, he says, I've heard you've tried to stop this. If you do, I won't go to heaven,
mhm.
basically.
Yeah.
So forget faith alone. I mean, it's not even works alone. It's by sacrifice and martyrdom alone will I
Mhm,
be saved, um, which is a funky one for him.
mhm,
And eventually he ends up being martyred. And he's from a very strong tradition then. So he's appointed by Peter, he knows John, he writes letters to Polycarp, this other great titanic figure in the 2nd century,
mhm.
who's loved by Irenaeus,
Yep.
because they also have a relationship. And Ignatius then sort of goes through this really weird phase because after he's killed traditionally, Polycarp writes about him twice, depending on what parts of Polycarp's letter you think is authentic, and says, "Well, I miss my friend." He
Mhm,
wants to know. Clearly he wants to know what happened to his friend. He knows he was sent to be killed, but it's not quite what happened. But then Ignatius is largely just put to one side. Irenaeus quotes him once, but anonymously. He just says, "As a certain one among us said,"
mhm,
so doesn't name check him. Origin quotes him twice, but again, in passing.
mhm,
And then nobody really cares. Eusebius is the first one to pick him back up. He talks about his martyrdom, his 7 letters that he supposedly wrote, and the influence he had on early Christians. And then that's it. He vanishes again. So he both stands in tension in some ways between this great colossal titanic figure who's from the apostolic succession of Peter and John and passes on to Polycarp and then Irenaeus, and yet nobody cares. And that's really odd.
mhm,
Polycarp gets a lot more traction, even though we've only got 1 letter by him.
mhm,
Everyone loves him. They think he's the great hero of Smyrna. But Ignatius writes us more, even more, and he
mhm,
just gets put to one side. So that's who he is, and in many ways, actually, his importance is underestimated in 2 ways. One, because actually, apart from Paul, he provides us with the largest corpus, to, depending on how many letters you
Sure.
think he wrote, the largest corpus of early Christians in the 2nd century. I mean, he writes lots comparatively. I mean, Polycarp, as I said, gives us one. Clement, oh, who knows what's going on with one
Oh,
Clement? But I mean, let's just assume for 1 second that one Clement's all his. That's pretty big. Two
mhm,
Clement, I think we can all agree, is not.
mhm,
So yeah, I mean, Ignatius is massive. And then on top of that, Ignatius is always used by our New Testament colleagues to help date the Bible or the New
mhm,
Testament
mhm,
because he makes in the middle recension great use of Matthew and John, of 1 Corinthians, Ephesians. So again, he's a really helpful figure because if Ignatius writes around 110 and has access to this cornucopia of New Testament texts, or bada bing, bada boom. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, easy pickings for dating off our New Testament in the first century.
Yeah.
He also shows a great awareness in the Middle Recension of theology such as the resurrection, Eucharistic theology. I'd also the Middle Recension is more likely to tend towards Trinitarian, but again, I wouldn't want to quite go that far just for the case of anachronism.
Mm-hmm.
So he's a massive figure, both for scholars but also for the early church, and yet he's just massively passed over for some strange reason.
Now, isn't he the one from whom we get the name Docetists? Isn't that in one of his letters where he's whether it's his or not, I guess, where he's talking about people who claim that Jesus's suffering was in appearance alone. That's
Yeah,
Ignatius, isn't it?
it is. It's in Smaneans, and again, that's a Middle Recension text only,
Hmm.
neither in the short. But yeah, I mean, so again, one of the other big parts of Ignatius is he is the absolute combatant for orthodoxy,
Hmm.
and in every recension he says, "Beware those who teach heterodoxy, for they will make themselves seem great." And so he's very alive to these wandering teachers who are coming around spouting some stuff and then going away again.
Hmm.
And he says, no, no. And then he expounds a little bit more in the middle recension about what that means. And as you said, he says that there are those who believe that Jesus was like a phantasm,
Yeah.
and they do not go to communion. Wow, for Ignatius, I mean that's wild. If you don't go to
Hmm.
communion, you're well out. I mean,
Hmm.
that's it. That's it for you.
Yeah.
Not to quote Pius X into Ignatius of Antioch, but it's sort of that thing of unless you receive the surest way to get to heaven is to receive his body and blood. I mean,
Hmm.
Ignatius, that could have come out of Ignatius's mouth.
Yeah.
No Eucharist, or well, again, careful with the wording, but definitely no communion, no salvation,
Hmm.
no way. Again, exclusively middle recension, but yeah,
Hmm. So let- let's talk a little bit more about the theology then, because you had mentioned, um, in the when did you say it was the 1490s, when
yeah.
some of these debates really started to spring up again, and then it really kind of became a sticking point between Catholics and the Calvinists in
Mm.
the 16th century. What's going on in the theology of the Ignatian letters that are more confidently Ignatius, and then some that might be a little bit questionable?
Well, one's confidence is obviously based on, if we take the middle recension first, which again I need to reiterate to everyone is the scholarly consensus, even though I think that it's wrong. And the middle recension, which is they were dealing only with the long recension in the 1600 in the 1500s, to be fair to them, which has loads more Catholic theology. But for the sake of our question today, we'll just deal with the middle and the short. Um, so the middle recension has three things that I would say make it, in some ways, more supportive of the Catholic position rather than the Protestant one. And actually, there was quite a lot of controversy recently with a guy called Dr. James White, who was in a debate where he denied Ignatius existed
Hmm.
quite clearly because he's worried about some of the theology in his letters. The first one and the most obvious one has to be the Eucharist. Ignatius says things like, I desire the bread of God, which is the flesh of our Lord Jesus Christ, and his blood, which is love incorruptible.
Hmm.
That to me, I think, is fairly explicit language, particularly from a Catholic perspective, about what he might think about that.
Hmm.
He also says that he repeats again and again about how Jesus Christ is flesh. It's his flesh, right? So again, pretty Catholic.
Hmm.
He then says that there is quite clearly a distinct threefold ecclesial hierarchy. There's none of this charismatic leader business. No, as the Didache mentions in other texts, prophets or teachers or whatever else. We have deacons, we have priests, and my goodness, we have bishops. And the bishop is the central figure in this early Christian period. Without him, you bust. And in
Hmm.
fact, he goes one further. He says, if you are apart from your bishop, you will be destroyed.
Hmm.
Wow, that's pretty deep.
Hmm.
Um, Now, pretty rich coming from a bishop, one might say, but nonetheless, this threefold ecclesial hierarchy is the core part of what he does. And in 2006, Ignatius Alan Brent wrote a fantastic book called Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic, where he talks about how Ignatius understands the bishop as the image of God the Father.
Mm,
And so the liturgical procession that flows out from that, of the priests, which are like Jesus, and the deacons, which are, just sort of circling around as ministers, this is all very rich theology.
mm,
Again, something that I think is definitely late second century or maybe even third century, not early, but Alan was working on the middle century being genuine.
mm,
And then the third thing is his words about the church in Rome. In his letter to the Romans, there's this very controversial opener where he says, I greet the church in Rome which presides in love. And it's not clear to some whether Ignatius refers here to the church Catholic universal or the church in the region of Rome.
mm.
Now, in the Syriac, it's really obvious that it refers to the region of Rome
Okay.
and its environs. It's very clear. The Syriac is couldn't be any more obvious, I don't think. But in the Greek and the Latin, it was been argued about. What's he referring to here? And if you take the Catholic position, then he's quite obvious talking about the Catholic Universal Church.
Mm,
But again, some of the more Protestant scholars like Lightfoot and Zahn have said no, actually, the bishop, yes, he does preside in love, but only over the walls and the place it finds itself within. So 2.5, let's say, of Catholic-y material that people like John Calvin jumped out their skin at.
yeah.
Lightfoot and Zahn were willing to let that stuff go, particularly Lightfoot. It's interesting that his decision to go against the three-letter collection happens after he becomes a bishop. That's when he really starts to argue in favour of the seven, which place the bishop in more of a central role.
Mhm.
I'm not. That's not an ad hominem. I'm not saying he had no other reasons. I'm just saying it is serendipitous that those two things seem to collide.
You know, I so he's a martyr. I want to try to find a way to frame this question here, um, because we've talked about a lot of very interesting things about Ignatius. So you mentioned he was martyred. He shipped off to Rome to be martyred by the Emperor Trajan. Now, Trajan, we know we have correspondence between him and Pliny the Younger, whom he sent to Smyrna to investigate the local Christian community there to see if they were up to no good, if they were up
Hmm.
to some kind of conspiratorial nonsense. And that correspondence is very interesting for looking at uh, Roman policies towards the Christians at the time. And the fact that when Pliny, if I remember right from the correspondence, writes back to Trajan and says, yeah, I've inquired with these people. I tortured a couple of them to get some information from them. Um, they seem like a bunch of wackos who gather together at certain times to celebrate and this and that. But it doesn't really seem like they're conspiring to bring down the empire. And Trajan's response suggests that there wasn't an official Roman policy at the time for what to do with these Christians. I'm curious if he was martyred, executed during Trajan's reign. Well, what was it that what do we know what it was that brought about his own persecution?
Well, if we believe the martyrdom stories, it was just that he's a Christian,
Mm,
and that's enough.
mm,
And we do get this trial actually, where in the martyrdom story, where Ignatius does actually have a correspondence with Trajan.
mm,
Even this is almost certainly fiction.
yeah.
Um, if we just look at the middle recension of the seven letters, uh, all we know, and I'll focus on those because it's supposedly from the words of the man himself, depending on which recension. He's just arrested and picked up in Rome for being, in Antioch for being a Christian, and taken by 10 soldiers to be to Rome to be executed. And he goes through Neapolis and Troas and all these places where he's visited by all of these Christians, particularly by the Ephesians of the church at Ephesus who visit him, and they have secretaries who write letters for him and all this sort of stuff. The reason why I say this is all very cautious, I'm cautious about this, is because in the short recension we don't get this story.
mm,
It's not clear that he was picked up in Antioch, for example.
mm,
It's clear that he's going to his death. And we also get the story of 10 soldiers are carrying him. But we also don't get this great visiting party,
mm,
which to me seems quite funny and
mm,
unbelievable almost.
mm,
So, what I say we know about the reasons for and the journey of Ignatius to his death is actually zero from the horse's mouth, and that
mm,
is the words of later martyrologies that are trying to put these things back to
mm,
sort of create hagiographies, basically, of how
mm,
great he was. Um, Again, I point this out in my book that we have no evidence of a singular prisoner being picked up as far away as Antioch and being taken to Rome under the guidance or under the under these 10 soldiers. So 10 soldiers dedicated just to one man who's
mm,
a nobody. I mean, Ignatius is a nobody in the grand scheme of things, from Antioch to Rome just to be killed. I mean,
mm,
that's crazy talk,
mm,
right? We may take that then a step further. Ignatius says they're like leopards, these guys. They're vicious in every extension. Yeah, in the middle it says, well, I thank Onesimus, the Bishop of Ephesus, and Crocus, and all these other fellas who have come and given me great refreshment, and they've helped disseminate the letters that I've written to all of the churches around me. Well, look, come on now. You're arrested for being a Christian. You're now being guarded by a load of head cases, and they're allowing you to write proselytizing material to churches? Come on. I mean, how is that? How am I meant to believe that's happened?
mm,
Whereas in the short version, all we get told is, well, I've been picked up. It's pretty miserable. I'm going to Rome. And that pickup could have been anywhere in the West. Now we have some evidence for cases where people have been picked up even as far west as sort of Smyrna
mm,
and been taken to Rome, but again minor. So my thought process is that he could have been picked up basically anywhere,
mm.
but it can't have been Antioch. I mean that's so long. That's a long journey.
Yeah, so it's an interesting observation because Smyrna, gosh, if I remember my geography here, Smyrna is in the far west of modern day Turkey, right? Would it be southwest modern day Turkey or northwest? I can't remember.
I can't remember whether it's south or north, but yeah, west. Let's go
Yeah,
west.
west, far west. And then Antioch is what? That would be modern day Syria, right? Or is that still in Turkey today? But it's very far to the southeast of Turkey, if it's in Turkey. I can't remember. But there's a huge
Well,
geographical gap between the two.
let me tell you that there is a 1,083 kilometers.
Okay.
So I mean, that's a long
Yeah.
way.
So it is, just the fact that Smyrna is so much closer to Rome, um, it would make more sense for people to get arrested kind of further out that way in the empire rather than all the way in Antioch. And this
I
guy,
mean,
he's a bishop, but he's
to
not. Uh,
to be clear, that's still a long way, right? I mean, that's
yeah.
still 2,000 kilometers.
Mhm,
Now, again, I don't see any reason why he couldn't have been picked up in Greece,
mhm,
right? Because I mean, it could have been anywhere.
mhm,
Now, again, some have suggested to me that all of the story is a lie. And Ignatius, he was killed, but wherever. Roger Parvu, in his 2008 book, actually suggests the opposite, that he was arrested in somewhere in Asia Minor and brought to Antioch to be killed.
mhm.
Now, I think
Well,
that's pretty speculative,
yeah.
and we have no evidence of that. But again, show me. I cannot find other case studies of people who were taken 2,000 kilometers plus with 10 soldiers dedicated solely to them, who were allowed to write letters because their mates came along,
Mhm,
spreading the message of the very thing they were apparently arrested for.
mhm.
That seems very hard to believe.
Um, and most of that comes from the martyrologies, correct? That story.
Yes,
Yeah.
but it's also again the further bit about he went to Troas and Neapolis. is in the middle recension.
The middle recension, right?
So he ends at the end in chapter 7, I think, of Polycarp. He says, "I'm really sorry. This letter's only been brief. I've been asked to. I now have to travel from one place to the next." But he also gives this sort of rather Homeric, sort of Odyssey-like account. I've travelled by land and sea, and you're thinking, well, what are you, Saint Paul or Odysseus? I mean, you know. This is sort of the classic trope that we find
Mhm,
of later martyrologies, that they give you these sort of classical stories
mhm.
echoing the great heroes like Odysseus and
Yeah.
indeed I'm sure Paul. I mean, I actually think in many ways Paul's journey's echoing Homeric literature
Mm.
as well. I've been shipwrecked 3 times and all the rest of it. It's like, well, yeah, I know someone else who did that back in the day. I think it's someone else Homer knows.
Well, I mean, it's not surprising, that martyrologies would pick up on tropes, the classical tropes with which the readers would have been familiar. And I mean, that's kind of a predecessor to the hagiographical material that would come out in, starting in the fourth century, where it's not as much the classical literature as much as it is the Gospels and the stories of Christ that the writers are trying to connect the main subject to.
Yeah, 100%. And let me just actually just because I can see some of the comments I get from this when I say this sort of thing. So let me preempt some of the ones maybe in yours. Is that people then leap from this and say, well, the story's so unbelievable, Ignatius probably didn't exist, and these
Mhm,
letters are probably false. And actually, I say the opposite. I say that the short recension actually is really interesting because A, it doesn't give this great story. But second, one of the things I love about the short recension is that it's not very helpful for justifying theological positions.
mhm.
In the short recension, Ignatius's theology is what I call narrow and shallow. He knows basically nothing, and he goes into detail about even less. Um, even to the point where he doesn't know the resurrection.
Yeah.
Right, he has no bones to pick. Whereas in the middle recension, you see it come out all over the place. Right, he's like careful of the Donatists, careful of people who reject the Eucharist. Oh, you must believe in the incarnation and the resurrection. Actually, here's the biblical texts we use. These are the authoritative ones. In the short recension, I just again for viewers at home, he actually doesn't make any explicit reference to any New Testament text, Paul or Gospel,
Mm,
which is madness,
mm,
right? Because again, he's the great source for New Testament scholars to base their early Christian stuff, their early Christian texts into the first century.
mm,
You expect me to believe that someone had the middle recension at the end of the second century and then took out all of these biblical references and references to the resurrection and indeed many of the times where the name of Jesus is used? Come on now. Ain't nobody doing that. No, ain't nobody doing that. Whereas what you can see is why people would seek to retrospectively put into Ignatius the Gospel of Matthew, the resurrection.
mm,
Because look, let's say you are Irenaeus or Origen, and you're reading this guy Ignatius, you think, well, he's quite important. I mean, he's from the lineage of Polycarp.
mm.
He doesn't know the resurrection. He doesn't know our Gospels. Or Paul, he mentions the name of Paul, but he doesn't know any of his letters, and indeed sometimes even contradicts Paul, particularly about slavery. Paul says, if you can get freedom from being a slave, you should do that. Ignatius says, under no circumstances should a slave ever be set free. They'll become corrupt to their own lust.
Mm.
You're like, whoa, okay, that's a different take. So you can see how, for me, these texts would evolve that way rather than be destroyed the other way. Um, but yeah, I mean, on the subject of his martyrdom more widely, I think the story is true that he's martyred, and I think he does write these letters because ultimately, to write this three-letter collection for any other reason, I kind of think of a motive, right?
Mhm,
You've written a text that justifies no theological position at all.
mm.
It's useless.
Well, what's really interesting about that is, we started this conversation talking about Catholic Protestant debates on how to read and receive Ignatius. Uh, but then we have the Syriac translation, so neither Catholic nor Protestant in the Western sense of that term, anyway.
It does
Um,
mention bishops. The short recension does mention bishops.
okay.
And in Polycarp 6, it does mention priests and deacons. However, Polycarp 6 also seems to have problems in the short recension. On saying that, I think that Calvin probably could have stomached the short recension.
Mm.
speaking as an ex-Calvinist, I
Mm,
think he probably could have stomached it. Luther definitely. I mean, Luther and some of the others. I mean, definitely, obviously in the UK, Cranmer and their grouping
mhm,
under Henry VIII, they could have all bought into it, no problem.
mm.
But the middle recension is the sticky wicket.
Okay, interesting. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. How much we still have to know about a guy who wrote relatively little compared to some of our later Christian writers who, like Augustine, who wrote tons and tons, and Origen, who wrote tons and tons. Um, Regardless of how big or small the letter collection of Ignatius is, the authentic letter collection, there's still a lot we need to learn about the guy. And I hope this conversation here has piqued some people's interest. I know I'm actually quite interested in learning a little bit more, especially as I myself am getting into manuscript studies and paleography. Jack Bull, thank you very much for a very wonderful and interesting conversation.
Pleasure to be here. Go and read Ignatius in any recension.
Indeed. All right. Like I said, I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation, and I will see you on the next episode, whenever that shall be. Take care and have a great weekend.